For this section, we're going to define coevolution, talk about why it's different than other evolutionary interactions, and then we'll review and give you some specific examples of the types of ecological interactions for which we commonly see coevolution occurring. So coevolution is when the changes, behavior, qualities of one species have an immediate and direct impact on the evolution of a second species. Now, the reason why we treat this as its own subcategory is it is a very complicated thing, almost like these game theory ideas we've been talking about, where the behavior and changes in one population can have a dramatic and a dynamic impact on a species on which it is dependent or that it directly impacts. And so it really is a lot different than, say, the environment changes and then a species evolves and changes because of the environment, because there aren't these complicated interactions and these feedback loops, right? So when the environment gets warmer, species adapt to be warm. That doesn't really have a direct impact where species adapt to be warm. That has a feedback onto the environment, back and forth. Now, occasionally there can be some somewhat less complex interactions between species and environments and back and forth, but usually it's kind of a one-way thing, right? Droughts occur and then species adapt. The species don't cause the drought. Obviously with humans we're having some impact on our environment, but most of the time species don't impact their environment. However, when two species are interacting with one another, there can be dramatic and dynamic changes back and forth. And what's good for one species may also be good for the species in its environment, or it might be bad for them, and then they may have to adapt or move out or even go extinct if they are unable to adapt to the changes of the species in their environment. So we're going to review the 6 types of ecological interactions and remind you that you only need to know for evolution really these first 3, and we'll talk about why. Mutualism is where two species that share an environment have a beneficial impact on one another. If we remove species 1, species 2 doesn't do as well, and vice versa. So they're partners. They help each other. In antagonism, one species does well by interacting with the other species, but the other one shows a negative effect, a detrimental effect. Commensalism is where one species does really well because of the other species, and then the second species, it doesn't really matter. It's not good, it's not bad. They have a neutral interaction with the species 1. Now, you can look at these other 3. You may have learned them in other classes. We're not going to talk about them. The reason that we focus on these first 3 is this is where we get coevolution commonly occurring, particularly in mutualism and antagonism. But in commensalism, it can occur also. And the reason why we see coevolution occurring in these relationships is because they're species that are dependent on one another. Now notice these are the 3 relationships that have at least one positive net benefit interaction. The negative ones do. Now with competition, when there's negative, you can get a little bit with commensalism. By definition, mutualism, there's no impact. But really, the big 3 are mutualism, antagonism, and commensalism. And the reason is because of that plus interaction. That one species, or both species in the case of mutualism, are dependent on the other species. And so because they are dependent, they have to change and evolve if their partner species evolves and changes. So for instance, if you are a predator and you are dependent on one main prey item, if that prey evolves and gets larger or more spread out, you have to adapt to survive or you're going to die. And so the evolution of that species is going to have an immediate and dramatic impact on you. So let's just review examples of these 3 big ones, because we're going to be talking about lots of coevolutionary examples as we move forward. Mutualism, here are some common examples. Plants and their pollinators are in a mutualistic relationship. The plant gets a reproductive service, right? They're basically transferring gametes, and the pollinator gets a food source. And so it's a win-win situation. Coral have these endosymbiotic organisms that live inside of them and provide some photosynthetic nutrients. So the organisms live inside, they get a safe place to live, and they provide a little bit of food for their host. Now, there's some very interesting environments that rely on very unusual mutualistic relationships. One of the fairly recently discovered one of the last ecosystems discovered on Earth, is in the very deep oceans near these rich volcanic vents where sulfur and methane and other inorganic materials are being spewed out by the volcanic activity. And in these environments, these hot water, there are certain bacteria that thrive. They actually do something called chemosynthesis, so they don't get energy from the sun, but they get their energy from these chemicals. And many organisms use those bacteria in chemosynthetic relationships. This is one of the few ecosystems that is not dependent directly on energy from the sun. So anyway, the bacteria get a safe place to live by living in a tube worm or on the hairy arms of a crab, and the organisms that host the bacteria get food. Now, I've put a picture of a mitochondria on here. Now, technically, mitochondria are no longer what we would call a mutualistic relationship because they have become an integrated part of eukaryotic organisms. We no longer consider them as separate entities. But originally, this relationship started as a mutually beneficial endosymbiotic relationship, right? We had a bacteria that began living in a proto-eukaryotic cell. The bacteria got a safe place to live away from the dangers of the outside world, and it provided some excess energy to the cell in which it lived. And so this mutualistic relationship was reinforced and reinforced until mitochondria became an integral part of all eukaryotic cells. And for many years, we didn't even recognize that it was once a free-living organism. So those are all examples of mutualism. Antagonism, often when you learn this one, you'll learn parasitism. But that's really just one form of antagonism. So antagonism is a better general term. So we've got parasitism, right? This is a coronavirus drawing, at least, a reconstruction of what the coronavirus looks like. It benefits by having a place to live, living inside its host. The host has a detrimental impact, right? We get sick, maybe even die, depending on the parasite that is infecting us. But it's not good. That's why we call them a parasite. So that's an antagonistic relationship. But there are two other very common ones, and then some less common ones that we won't really worry about. But beetles or other herbivores on a leaf that are skeletonizing it, eating it, that's bad for the plant. Now realize there are going to be some coevolutionary interactions here, and we'll talk about examples of many of these. So if the plant evolves some sort of chemical that is noxious to the beetle, that's a good thing for the plant. But it's bad for the beetle if that's its only host plant. It either has to evolve so it can get around that noxious chemical, or it's going to go extinct. And then finally, the third common type of antagonism is predator-prey interactions. So I've got a cheetah here chasing an impala. Obviously not good for the impala, right? It's going to die or at least be under stress or get injured. But the cheetah benefits from having them there. They could not survive without their prey items. And then the third type of ecological interaction that we're going to spend time on is commensalism. The cattle egret is a great example of a commensal relationship. So these, and you can see this down here in South Texas, these birds will seek out livestock. Today it's mainly domesticated, but in the past it might be large bison or herds of deer or elk. They will seek them out because as they graze, they disturb grasshoppers and small rodents and other things, and then the birds, which are predators, get a meal out of it. Now, if the birds go away, it doesn't make any difference at all to the cattle. It doesn't help the cattle, doesn't hurt the cattle. That's a commensal relationship. The remora, which is these fish that have a suction-like cup on their head, and actually I think it's on the ventral side. Anyway, they stay near the sharks, they get a free ride, but they also pick up scraps that the shark wouldn't need, doesn't eat anyway, so it doesn't hurt the shark, right? So that is a commensal relationship. And then my final example, and there are many more, but the final example of commensalism I've got on here are bromeliads. Bromeliads are a type of an epiphytic plant, meaning that they live on other plants. Now, if the bromeliads are there or not, it doesn't really harm the trees. It's just a place for them to rest. They don't pull nutrients up from the tree. It doesn't hurt the tree for them to be on it. There are some types of parasitic plants that will get onto other plants. But epiphytes don't hurt the plant. They just get a good place higher up in the canopy to sit. So it benefits the epiphyte, and the tree doesn't have any impact one way or the other. Now again, remember, mutualism, antagonism, commensalism. And we are talking about these because they have these close, tight interactions where one species at least is benefiting. And so that means that there is the possibility, sometimes very strong possibility, for coevolution. And we're going to look at examples of that in the next discussion.